Have you ever watched someone just disappear? No big announcement. No dramatic goodbye speech. One day they're replying to messages, showing up to gatherings, liking posts, laughing at jokes. And then slowly, almost quietly, they stop. The replies get shorter. The visits become rare. Eventually, there's nothing. No calls. No updates. No explanation that feels satisfying enough. From the outside, it can look cold, even harsh. People say things like, they just cut everyone off, or they don't care about anyone but themselves, or that's so extreme. But psychology rarely sees human behavior as random or cruel. It sees patterns, adaptations, strategies that may not make sense on the surface, but once served a purpose deep inside someone's nervous system. And when you look closer, people who cut everyone off are usually not trying to punish others. They're trying to survive something internally that feels unsustainable. To understand this, you have to step away from the idea that humans are always moving toward connection. Yes, we are social creatures. Yes, we are wired for belonging. But we are also wired for protection. And when connection starts to feel like a threat instead of a resource, the brain can flip a very old switch. Withdraw. Reduce exposure. Create distance. Not because it doesn't want relationships, because it no longer trusts them to be safe. Imagine your emotional life like a house. For most people, relationships are like doors and windows. They let in light, conversation, warmth. But if too many storms come through those openings, if enough wind knocks things over, if enough rain floods the floors, eventually the brain starts boarding things up. Not because it hates sunlight, because it's tired of cleaning up damage. People who cut others off often reach that point slowly. It's rarely impulsive. More often, it's the result of accumulated emotional experiences that taught their brain a painful lesson. Engagement equals exhaustion. Vulnerability equals disappointment. Closeness equals unpredictability. And the brain, incredibly efficient as it is, decides to simplify the equation. If interaction keeps hurting, remove interaction. Psychologists sometimes describe this through the lens of attachment theory. You might have heard of secure attachment, where people feel generally safe relying on others. But there are also patterns called avoidant or dismissive attachment, which don't mean someone is incapable of love or empathy. They mean the person learned, often early in life, that depending on others was unreliable, overwhelming, or even punished. So instead of seeking comfort from people, they learned to regulate themselves alone. Self-sufficiency became not just a trait, but an emotional survival skill. As children, some individuals grow up in environments where their needs weren't consistently met, or where expressing vulnerability didn't lead to reassurance. Maybe caregivers were emotionally unavailable. Maybe conflict was frequent. Maybe love was present but unpredictable. The nervous system adapts by turning inward. It says, handle it yourself. Don't expect too much. Don't lean too hard. That adaptation can make someone appear very independent, highly functional, even impressive. They don't ask for help. They don't rely on others. They manage. But inside, that independence can come with a quiet cost. Because when closeness begins to feel like something you have to manage rather than enjoy, relationships start to feel like work. Constant emotional labor, constant negotiation, constant vigilance. And over time, exhaustion builds. Now imagine adulthood arrives, bringing friendships, romantic relationships, workplaces, social expectations. On paper, everything looks normal. But internally, each new bond activates that old wiring. Stay careful. Don't get too invested. Keep control. If enough stressors stack up, if enough disappointments confirm those early lessons, the brain eventually chooses what feels like the most efficient solution. Total disengagement. It's not a dramatic emotional decision. It's more like psychological burnout. You know how a phone overheats when too many apps are running? Instead of closing one app at a time, sometimes the system just shuts down completely to cool off. That's what cutting everyone off can feel like internally. Not revenge. Not indifference. Shut down. There's even neurological evidence that social pain and physical pain share overlapping pathways in the brain. The same regions that activate when you stub your toe can activate when you feel rejected or chronically misunderstood. So if someone has experienced repeated relational stress, their nervous system can begin to interpret social environments as physically taxing. Distance then becomes regulation. Solitude becomes relief. And this is where outsiders often misunderstand what's happening. Because from the outside, withdrawal looks like apathy. But from the inside, it can feel like finally being able to breathe. No expectations. No misunderstandings to navigate. No emotional calculations. Just quiet. For some people, that quiet feels like the first sense of control they've had in years. But here's the paradox. Humans don't stop needing connection just because they withdraw from it. The need doesn't disappear. It gets buried under layers of protection. So while the behavior looks like, I don't need anyone, the psychology is often closer to, I don't know how to need people safely. And that distinction changes everything. Next, we'll explore what actually happens in the brain when someone begins emotionally shutting doors, why cutting people off can feel empowering at first, and how this behavior is often less about rejecting others and more about reclaiming a sense of self that felt lost inside too many relationships. At first, cutting everyone off can feel strangely powerful. Not loud, dramatic power. More like quiet control. The kind you feel when you cancel plans, silence notifications, stop explaining yourself, and suddenly realize there's no one demanding anything from you. No emotional negotiations. No subtle pressure to respond the right way. Just space. For someone who has felt overwhelmed by relational expectations, that space can feel like oxygen after being underwater too long. Psychologically, this is where something called negative reinforcement kicks in. When you remove a stressor and immediately feel relief, your brain learns very quickly that the removal was a good decision. It doesn't ask whether the solution is sustainable. It just registers. That made the discomfort stop. Do that again. So the first boundary feels good. The second feels easier. The third becomes a habit. Eventually, distance becomes the default response to emotional strain. It's not unlike cleaning out a cluttered room. At first, you remove a few things and feel better. Then you realize how much calmer the space feels without them. Then you start questioning everything. Do I even need this? Why was I holding on to it? And before long, the room is almost empty. But human relationships are not furniture. They carry emotional complexity. And while reducing contact can reduce stress, it doesn't automatically resolve the internal patterns that made those relationships feel overwhelming in the first place. This is where neuroscience adds another layer to the story. When someone repeatedly withdraws to regulate themselves, their brain starts strengthening neural pathways associated with self-reliance and emotional suppression. The prefrontal cortex, which helps with planning and control, begins working overtime to manage feelings internally, while the systems that process shared emotional regulation with others become less active through lack of use. In simpler terms, the brain gets really good at being alone. That can look like independence. And sometimes it truly is. But sometimes it's more like emotional muscle memory. If you've practiced distancing for long enough, closeness can start to feel unfamiliar, even intrusive. Have you ever taken a long break from exercise and then returned, only to find movements that used to feel natural now feel awkward? Emotional reconnection can be like that. Not impossible, just uncomfortable at first. Another piece of this puzzle is identity. Many people who cut others off are not just seeking relief. They're trying to rediscover who they are outside of constant relational roles. For years, they may have been the mediator, the caretaker, the dependable one, the one who always understood everyone else. And somewhere along the way, their own preferences got blurry. When they step back from relationships, it can feel like reclaiming authorship over their own life. Suddenly, choices aren't filtered through, how will this affect everyone else? They become, sometimes for the first time, what do I actually want? That question can be both liberating and terrifying, because once you start asking it, you realize how rarely you did before. Psychologists sometimes call this process individuation. It's the development of a self that isn't entirely shaped by external expectations. It's not about rejecting others. It's about establishing an internal anchor. But here's where things get complicated. The same withdrawal that allows someone to reconnect with themselves can also prevent corrective emotional experiences. If every relationship is cut off before it has the chance to be different, the brain never gathers evidence that connection can be safe, flexible, or mutual. So the protective strategy reinforces itself. Distance prevents pain, but it also prevents disconfirmation of fear. This doesn't mean cutting people off is always unhealthy. In some cases, stepping away from genuinely harmful environments is necessary. Psychology absolutely recognizes the importance of boundaries, especially when someone has been in relationships marked by chronic stress, invalidation, or imbalance. But the mechanism doesn't always distinguish between protection and overprotection. The same instinct that helps someone leave a damaging situation can later keep them from forming nourishing ones. It's like an immune system that became so vigilant it starts reacting to things that aren't actually threats anymore. And emotionally, this can create a strange duality. On one hand, there's calm, predictability, freedom from interpersonal strain. On the other hand, there can be an undercurrent of loneliness that doesn't quite match the narrative of, "I'm better off this way." Humans are remarkably good at rationalizing behaviors that began as coping mechanisms. The mind builds stories to match the choices we've already made. But the nervous system often tells a more nuanced truth. You can value solitude and still long for understanding. You can enjoy independence and still miss companionship. You can protect yourself and still wonder whether you've built walls too thick to see over. None of that makes someone contradictory. It makes them human. And this is why labeling people who withdraw as cold, uncaring, or antisocial misses the deeper psychological reality. More often, they are individuals whose brains learn to associate closeness with depletion and who are now trying, sometimes imperfectly, to recalibrate. The real story is not about rejecting others. It's about managing emotional bandwidth. Next, we'll explore how this pattern can evolve, what it looks like when someone begins cautiously reopening connection without losing themselves, and why cutting everyone off is rarely the end of the story. It's usually a pause in it. If cutting everyone off were the final destination, the story would end there. Silence. Distance. A life lived entirely in self-contained orbit. But psychologically, that's almost never where things stop. Because once the nervous system settles, once the constant pressure that drove the withdrawal begins to fade, something else tends to surface. Curiosity. Not a dramatic longing to rush back into relationships. Nothing that loud. More like small questions that appear in the quiet. What would it feel like to talk to someone without feeling drained? Is there a way to connect without losing myself? Was the problem always other people, or was it the way I had learned to show up? These questions signal something important. The brain is no longer in pure defense mode. It's beginning to reassess. When humans feel chronically overwhelmed, the nervous system narrows its focus to survival. Psychologists sometimes call this a state of protective constriction. Your emotional world becomes smaller because smaller feels safer. But as safety increases, the mind naturally starts expanding again. Exploration is our default setting when we're not under threat. This is why people who have gone through periods of total withdrawal often don't stay there forever. They begin experimenting. Very cautiously. Maybe it's replying to one message, meeting one person for coffee, reconnecting with someone who feels low pressure. And here's the key difference between this phase and the relationships that came before. The goal is no longer approval. It's sustainability. Instead of asking, "How do I keep this person happy?" the internal question becomes, "Can I stay myself while being here?" That shift may sound subtle, but neurologically it's enormous. The brain is learning to pair connection with regulation rather than depletion. Think of it like learning to swim differently. If you once thrashed in the water, exhausting yourself just to stay afloat, you might avoid swimming altogether for years. But when you return and discover a calmer stroke, something changes. The water isn't the enemy anymore. The way you were moving through it was. This is where boundaries, which once felt like walls, start becoming more like doors. Not permanently closed. Not permanently open. Just intentional. You let some people in. You leave others outside. You take breaks. You re-engage. You learn that connection doesn't have to mean total access. Psychologists often describe this as moving toward earned security. Even if someone didn't grow up with consistent emotional safety, they can develop it later through repeated experiences of balanced, respectful interaction. The brain is remarkably adaptable. Neuroplasticity doesn't stop at childhood. It keeps rewriting pathways based on new evidence. Every time someone has an interaction that doesn't overwhelm them, doesn't erase them, doesn't demand more than they can give, the nervous system updates its expectations. Slowly, cautiously, trust becomes less abstract. And something else tends to happen during this phase. People who once cut everyone off often become very intentional about who they reconnect with. They may prefer fewer relationships, but deeper ones. Less performance, more honesty, less frequency, more meaning. From the outside, this can still look like distance. But internally, it's very different from avoidance. It's selective engagement. There's a difference between hiding and choosing. This is why it's important not to romanticize or demonize withdrawal. It's neither purely unhealthy nor inherently enlightened. It's a response, sometimes necessary, sometimes overextended, often both at different times. Human behavior rarely fits into clean categories. Even historically, you can see echoes of this pattern. Writers, philosophers, and thinkers have long stepped away from society for periods of solitude, not because they rejected humanity, but because they needed distance to hear themselves think again. They returned not disconnected, but clarified. Your brain occasionally needs that same recalibration. But modern culture doesn't always understand this rhythm. We tend to interpret constant availability as emotional health. Always reachable, always responsive, always socially engaged. Yet psychology suggests that sustainable connection often requires cycles of engagement and retreat, much like breathing requires both inhaling and exhaling. If you only inhale, you suffocate. If you only exhale, you collapse. Balance is not constant presence. It's regulation. For someone who has cut everyone off, learning that rhythm again can take time. There may still be moments of retreat, days when silence feels safer than conversation. That doesn't mean progress is lost. It means the nervous system is still negotiating what feels manageable. And compassion, both from others and from oneself, matters enormously during this stage. Not pressure to come back, not judgment for stepping away, but space to re-enter connection at a pace that doesn't recreate the overwhelm that caused withdrawal in the first place. Because ultimately, the psychology of people who cut everyone off is not about rejecting relationships. It's about trying to protect a sense of self that once felt endangered within them. And when that self begins to feel stable again, connection often returns, not as obligation, but as choice. That's a very different kind of closeness. Quieter, less performative, but often far more resilient. So if you recognize yourself in this pattern, it doesn't mean you're broken, antisocial, or incapable of connection. It may mean your brain learned to protect you very well, maybe even too well. And now it's slowly learning that protection and participation don't have to be opposites. They can coexist. And if you've ever known someone who seemed to disappear, sometimes the most compassionate interpretation isn't that they stopped caring. It's that they were trying to breathe again. If this resonates with you, take a moment to reflect on where you are in that cycle. Are you in retreat, recovery, or cautious return? There's no universal timeline, just awareness. And awareness is where change always begins. If you want to keep exploring the psychology behind behaviors we often misunderstand, our own and others, stay curious, stay thoughtful, and stay with me. There's a lot more of the human mind worth unpacking together.